Hello, everyone. Welcome to our third edition of our monthly webinars. We are here with our guests to discuss and explore the importance of research, revision, and reuse of indigenous building construction materials and techniques to meet the current needs in the built environment. And if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the comment section if you have registered on Zoom and on Facebook if you're watching live. Without further ado, I would like to introduce my co-host, Quinn. Quinn would like to say hello.
Thank you, Teddy. I'd like to thank everyone for making the time to be on the call. Thank you, Teddy.
Thank you very much. And I would like to introduce our guests for today. We have Pedro Clarke. He is our in-local program director and founder of A+ Architecture. It's a practice that focuses on sustainable design and architecture. We also have Moabi. He's a curiosity-led creative generalist with predominant interests in regenerative land use management. We have as well as Ramohlaboli Khotte. He is an architectural designer. He's a lecturer at Limpopo University and head of school and member of faculty management group. Welcome, gentlemen. Pedro, Puputla, and Dr. Khotle, can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely. I didn't know if you wanted us to say anything, but loud and clear. Thank you.
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, before we can talk about the importance of indigenous architecture and materials, more commonly referred to as vernacular, we must define what is meant by these words. And we decided to use a quote by John Sojkowski, which we think exemplifies the topic. So he says that architecture is a unique component of a country's culture, just as much as its language, music, art, literature, or food. He says that architecture is also the most visual of those cultural components. This is called the genius loci, the spirit of a place. So every country has its own kind of genius loci, its own uniqueness. So vernacular architecture, the way he says it is composed of local materials and derived from local customs, techniques that have been passed on from generation to generation. So I'd just like to find out from you, gentlemen, what do you think would be important to add to this definition? Would you like to give us your personal definition of indigenous vernacular architecture?
Does anybody want to go first?
Please go ahead, Pedro. I'll follow.
Okay. I think that definition is very much accurate. I don't think I can add much to it, but I would like to just add a point, which is vernacular architecture normally comes, and indigenous materials, the use of them, come from the fact that for a very long time they were the technologies available. Therefore, in many cases, they became the technologies that were appropriate. And I like to use the term appropriate technology and appropriate building technologies in this case, which I associate very much with vernacular. Another big speaker on vernacular, and someone that's written much about this, is Paul Oliver, who coordinated preparing something called the Encyclopedia of Vernacular Architecture, that has a lot of examples from different types of buildings all over the place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pedro. I'd like to find out from you, Pax, how would you define? Pax, I would like to find out from you, what addition would you make to this definition, or what kind of personal definition would you give to the indigenous vernacular architecture? think we've lost Pax there for a second. Sorry, everybody. And Dr. Khotle, can you please give us your own personal definition, or if you think there's something that you'd like us to add to this definition?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, when we talk about vernacular, there is a part that has to do with indigenous materials or indigenous techniques. But one also has to be aware that, in every place you've had migration that's affected some of the ideas that are unique to the place. And so sometimes vernacular is the use of indigenous materials mixed with ideas that come from elsewhere, or it's the use of imported materials in a unique way that's been developed by the people of that place as well. So, with us sort of using indigenous and vernacular together, one has to kind of be careful of what exactly we are pointing to.
Okay, Dr. Khotle, but why is learning from a country's traditional building techniques and designs important to contemporary architecture?
I think for me, looking at contemporary issues, one of the biggest things that's facing us is the scarcity of resources. And with that, I think like Pedro said, appropriate technologies looks at being efficient in what we do. So given that these practices have been, historically the best that the people of the place could come up with, it kind of makes sense to go back to them in order to raise our efficiency. Whereas we live in a world where supply chains have led us to believe that you can get something from all the way across the world, and it might be the best way to do things. But for the cause of efficiency, I think the vernacular architecture will definitely play a huge part in us doing the best in our contemporary design.
Okay, that just for other people who don't, who would like to understand what the traditional building techniques are, could you just mention, a few specific Basotho construction materials, designs, or techniques that would be useful to reuse or revise to meet the modern lifestyle needs?
Okay, from what we've looked at, I think Basotho build mostly, first of all, from a point of view of the masses that our buildings are made out of, we would build single-use spaces in individual structures. So rather than have a house that's a complete structure, you'd have a series of huts that come together to create, the homestead. Then you have the use of rocks and some, adobe type of construction, thatching, and most of the material that's used is probably found in the immediate environment in traditional Basotho architecture.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khotle. That was very, very, very clear. I would like to pass, the ropes to my co-host, Quinn.
Thank you very much, Teddy. I'd like to say hello again to our lovely people, the host, Pedro and Dr. Khotle. Without wasting any time, Dr. Khotle, for a very good number of years, you were in the United States, and Pedro, you're based in Portugal, and would say these are some of the developed countries. But do you think it's necessary or important maybe for them to also use or go back to the traditional ways of materials that have been used in the past, or actually whatever locally sourced materials that are used? Pedro, you can start on that one. Do you think that's important?
I think in this interconnected world that we live in, as Indate Khotle was saying, it's very easy to imagine that we can import a solution from somewhere else. But history has proven that the fact that a material has been used in a particular place for over 500 years, 600 years, sometimes over almost a millennium, means that that material is appropriate for that location. What I see here in Portugal is, with a bit of resistance, there is a start of a return to more vernacular and indigenous materials. Buildings are starting to be sourced more locally. And for example, in our own practice, the work we do, we try to specify most of the things that come from Portugal. It's not a protectionist measure. It's a way of reducing the carbon footprint more than anything else. And it's also a way of making sure that if there's a problem in the future, the person who's going to deal with any maintenance issue is local, is not someone based in China or in the United States, which we never have contact with. So I think it's important, and it's not so much about sometimes being indigenous or not, because it might not be natively from here, but the fact that it's now produced here and has been adapted and people locally know how to use it, makes a lot of sense to use it. And then, as Ndate Khotle was talking about, and I've been lucky enough to have lived in Lesotho and see some of the vernacular structures and understand also, it's not just about the materials. Sometimes it's also about the design itself and the conception of space. The Lesotho rondavels originally also had a myth of creation behind it. So there's a whole history and story and culture that very quickly gets lost. Here in Portugal, we have similar things to do with the fact that we had a very big earthquake in 1755 that destroyed more than half of the city. And some of the technologies that derived from there have that history and have that understanding. Then, because of the onset of concrete as the primary technology in the beginning of the 20th century, that became the leading technology. But buildings started becoming very cold, very damp, and not appropriate for our climate. So it's always very good to look back at history, learn from the history, and then try and develop some kind of new vernacular or some ideas that can be more modern, but inspired by the vernacular practices. I think we've just found Pax back.
Okay, thank you very much. That's actually quite interesting. I like the part of planning for the future. Like, if you use locally sourced materials, it also help whoever will take over that construction or whatever project is that. And Dr. Khotle, what would you think from your experience, also from living abroad?
Yeah, I've seen this idea of returning to the vernacular. However tricky it might be to think of America's colonial past. I worked for a firm in South Carolina for about a year that was doing traditional neighborhood design. And they had identified that some of the modernist buildings that had come in, in the last 50 or so years since the World War, were not performing particularly well. And they were revisiting some of the Victorian era American design particularly for homes. That even went into how they designed those neighborhoods. And I think there's something to be said for, again, how the use of certain techniques and the materials that are sourced in the immediate environment help not only with cost, with issues of identity. So like I'm saying, it's tricky because now we're talking about America's history, and we're not talking about Native American design, but we're talking about colonial American vernacular. But I think there's a lot to be learned from that as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khotle. We have Pax again back on the line. Pax, I think you're quite have a big vast interest in the architecture and the locally used materials. Why do you think like most of us are not using these techniques as much as they should be using them, especially because it's materials that are usually found in lump sums?
Well, I think that there's really not one answer, and I've always kind of asked myself the same question, why? But well, I think it partly has to do with the belief or the sense of prestige of which we regard like contemporary materials with, and the connection we have with our past, our history. I think the issue is really more like psychological or a bit more like it's really hard to put a finger on, but I think it's because we kind of think our ancestors really in the past laid really nothing for us to build or anything on. I think we don't really respect or or admire what they have laid before. I mean, I think it's a lot of things that, not just in buildings, that I feel like Basotho don't value. I feel like we have so much from the past, but we never really, I don't know, we don't appreciate it. I think, I don't know why. I like everything from the past, and I think there's so much future in it and so much to learn, but I really can't speak for everyone. This is just my personal take.
Thank you, Pax. Ntate Khotle, Pedro.
Quinn, you muted yourself by mistake.
Sorry about that. Ntate Khotle, well, Pedro, you guys have a vast experience in the architecture field, both being architects and also being in developed countries. And the Khotle also being in the context of Lesotho. I think Pax also raises a very good thing when he says some things of not using this material is something that's psychological. So I'd love to know from you, Dr. Khotle, like, what do you think you guys as architects can do to influence the reintroduction of this use of indigenous materials?
Yeah, I think there's a responsibility that we carry to communicate with, our potential clients. And what we tend to do is to wait for the project to be, at hand for us to have this dialogue. But in reality, we need to, get people thinking, have this conversation about vernacular design. In more instances than when you meet a client. So for instance, having, designs that are not necessarily meant to be built, but to get people talking would be a good place to start. We also then have to talk to the authorities, because past the issues of how people feel about these things, there's also risk. When we talk about just something as common as thatching a roof, a lot of people are a bit put off by it because your insurance rates go through the roof, so to speak. And, getting people to understand that there is a treatment that we can give thatch to make it, more appropriate or fire retardant would be something that would help people warm up to the idea. And that's just one example, but there's a lot of standards and safety measures that we need to make people aware of. In connection to these materials and these techniques that do exist now or that we can put in place. And those would help people warm up to these ideas.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khotle. Pedro, I think same question. What do you think as architects, how do we stand a better chance of influencing people to actually take up this indigenous ways of building in vernacular architecture?
I think besides the work we do in designing buildings and besides the work we do in overseeing their construction, architects also have, the way I see it, a social obligation to overlook the built environment and to promote certain things that they believe in. So if you have a group of architects that believes in the use of vernacular technologies, indigenous materials, indigenous city planning, because it's also really interesting to think, there's a book by Bernard Rudowski, which is the basis of many sort of the vernacular discussions, which is called Architecture Without Architects. It's a really interesting book. And that book shows you patterns and cityscapes that were built totally without architects. And when we think about tourism here in Europe, the majority of people that travel, they go and see the old city centers. They rarely ever go and see a modern building. So ingrained in us somewhere, there is a passion for the old, for the vernacular, for how things came together. And if we don't talk about that and we don't try and do modern designs interpreted on this, the younger generations of architects are not going to care. And in the last 20 years in particular, there was this sort of explosion of star architects. So every young architect you'd meet in an architecture school admires Norman Foster or Zaha Hadid or Peter Rich, although Peter Rich is a bit of a special one because he looks into a lot of vernacular, or Makeke Makeke. There's many things that people look at, and their designs sometimes are not as appropriate as they could have been. And I think this kind of initiative, like we're on today, talking about vernacular and having exhibitions about vernacular buildings and promoting any initiative that talks about the past and the culture and how things were, is important. I remember I was a young, very young architect when I first came to Lesotho, and I was really lucky to have the Ramohlaboli Polytechnic invite me to come and do a lecture about architecture. And I was thrilled to talk to a group of 100 young students at the time. And they wanted me to talk only about the modern architecture in Europe. And I was like, well, you have amazing buildings here in Lesotho that I need to include in this presentation. So the first 10 minutes, I spoke about the buildings I had seen back at home and had fascinated me. And then the other 50 minutes, I spoke about the things I had seen and discovered in Lesotho in only 2 weeks that I'd been in the country at that moment. And what shocked me at the time was that the vast majority of the students there had never gone to look for those buildings in the villages, had never gone to admire the value of what they had, because it was what their grandparents had. And for them, it didn't have any sort of value beyond that emotional value. But there is an architectural value to it that's really important, and we need to promote it. And unfortunately, the city center of Maseru is now poorer because of the fire that took down the Lesotho hat, and the shield is still there, but without the hat, it's kind of left lonely. And there are challenges, as Ndati Khotle was saying. When we first did, the first building I ever built in Lesotho was with a thatch roof. And this might come almost as a shock, but because it was built with an NGO, we had to ask for a special permission from the Ministry of Works to actually have it in thatch. Because if you read the Lesotho building regulations, there's a rule about fire safety, and it requires that the material passes a certain test. And the way that that test is made means that thatch, even with the fire treatment, can't pass it, because the way the test is designed doesn't allow for the way the material behaves. Although the material can be perfectly safe once it's treated, or when I mean safe, the risk is controlled. But there's things in legislation that have come through. Some of it, unfortunately, is part of colonial legacies where some building standards from other countries were imported into Africa or into America without much consideration for how the local materials are. But I think the discourse is there, and it's really great to see people interested in it.
Thank you very much, Pedro. I think also Pedro raises a very good question, or a very good topic, when he says he went to give a lecture in one of the universities of Lesotho, the Ramohlaboli Polytechnic. So, Ndati Khotle, you having been having the pleasure of actually teaching both schools, do you think it's important for us to have such programs in our universities? And are we already starting to do that, or is it an afterthought that's going to happen?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's something that we need to do. And you would be amazed, just like Pedro said, that I think it also goes right into what Moabi Pax was saying, that as Basotho, we tend to have a negative attitude towards things that come from our history. I think in part as well, it's how little we understand about our history, because we tend to think that Lesotho or Sesotho, which is the Sotho way of doing things, is established when Mosheshe, established Lesotho as a country or as a nation. And we don't think about the long history that Bantu people have going back many centuries, and that there are buildings larger than the homesteads that were then built in the early establishment of the Basotho nation, that speak to what our ancestry has as a vernacular toolcase in architecture and in other arts and technologies. So getting students to think that far back is a great place to start. I think for me, my awareness of that started as a university student. I left Lesotho at the end of high school, really not even thinking about these things that Basotho come from further back than the establishment of the Basotho nation where we are today. So at Limco Queen, where I teach currently, we have out of 3 key courses in architectural history, The last one, we adapted, obviously our curriculum was firstly developed in Malaysia because it's a Malaysian institution. They were doing Islamic art and architecture as the third course. And we've adapted that to be an African art and architecture course. And we talk about things that date back to the 15th century in parts of West and Eastern Africa, Central Africa, and then we come down to the more recent history of Bantu people in Southern Africa.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khotle. Pedro, about the book that you suggested, can you also send that name of the book in the chat box? That would be very helpful. Pedro, I think follow-up question also to you. I think now that we're talking about this indigenous materials and ways that how we find them useful, I think we all agree that they're all useful. Looking back in the last year or looking back in the past 12 months during the pandemic, do you think it has somehow influenced the use of local materials because of the scarcity that came across during the production times because of this pandemic that we're in?
I think it's kind of a two-part answer. There is definitely an interest in using things more locally. And the fact that supply chains were disrupted has meant that people have gone back to using it, but it hasn't been a full adoption yet. I think what I know about the projects we do in Lesotho, I've seen the challenges we'd have with some of the supply chains, but a lot of it is still coming across the border and we get delays and waits because of that. But that's also because somewhere along the line, and the same thing happened here in Portugal, and even in the UK, where I also work, some of the trades and the craftsmanship has been overlooked. So there's not many people that want to become a skilled carpenter. There's not many people that want to become a skilled laborer or bricklayer. And until we get those things, it's hard for us to then develop more local technology and more local ways of doing things, because everybody would rather go to school and study to be an architect. And this might come as a shock for many people, but the majority of architects here in Portugal are worse paid than a carpenter. A carpenter is better paid, if he's skilled, than an architect, and people don't consider this. And I think until we start looking at that and giving value to every single part of the construction chain, we won't get a return to more local technology, because it's always easier to go into cash build and buy something off the shelf than have it manufactured for your own home. And until you have more people competing with that, cheaper, because your local craftsmen have to gain a living. So if they only build one door a month, that door is not going to be very cheap. If they have an order for 20 or 30 doors, then they can organize themselves, they can have scale to be able to compete and do things better.
Thank you very much, Pedro. I think you all, I like what you said also about people being artisans in different aspects, like some being big bricklayers, some being carpenters. There can also be people that actually just deal with steel, people that actually just deal with glass, or people that actually deal with aluminium. So this brings me a question to Pax. Pax, I know you're a very handy person, also finding a way of intertwining these materials that are found locally and also materials that are being manufactured from warehouses. Do you think like this trend, that's the recent trend of now materials being, people trying to explore different ways of using materials, would actually be helpful in the context of Lesotho?
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Quinn. I think it's very much needed. I mean, given the current economic, socio-economic and current, ecocide, by human behavior, I think there's never a better time than to consider all these materials. I mean, not so many people can afford like a house, so to say, like with all the modern standards, so to say. I mean, without just buying everything. I mean, then it calls for people to think out of the box, you know, and really look into, you know, what can be used. I feel like indigenous architecture is always born out of necessity. You know, it's always in a time period and given space and people trying to fulfill this need for shelter, and like just using what they can find in the best way possible. And I think the unique thing and the most valuable thing we have in Lesotho is that, you know, just like, you know, how this kind of architecture develops, it's always from one generation to another. And as it passes on, you know, each generation goes in and puts in something, you know, stamps in a unique future in it, you know, and passes on to the next. And that's how it grows. And I feel like our indigenous architecture as Lesotho or Bantu people has been kind of stagnant at some point in the past. So I feel like this is the best time. I think it's exciting, especially for Lesotho. I mean, I feel like also a lot of effort could be put into organizing this kind of materials, like, you know, how clay, for example, in Lesotho is not even considered so much as a valuable resource. I mean, you can just pretty much go anywhere and dig it up, you know, and it's very much valuable as a building material. And just adding value to these materials. And also, I think somehow building with local materials, you know, it connects you back to your environment. So if you're harvesting timber not far from your house, you know, to make posts, you know, and it really makes you think about your harvesting habits, and also you start thinking about the future. You know, now I think you can't even find thatch so easily in Lesotho. It costs a lot. I mean, most of it's not available, you know, where it used to be before. I think because we're not using it so much, people no longer care so much about these things. So I feel the value beyond just, you know, design and you know, all the details around these buildings is that they connect us to our land. They connect us really to the environment where we are. And I think this is a social, you know, psychological importance to it that I think is invaluable. And I think we cannot overlook that. I think there's no better time, Quinn.
Thank you very much, Pax. I think it's also good manners, like when you have a guest to actually talk to your guest. So I suppose say we'll be reading the questions from the people that joined the call. So be having Teddy to read out the questions, and we'll get back to our lovely host to finish up the wrapping up session. Thank you, Teddy.
Thank you very much, Quinn. Thank you. You know, this is a very heated conversation, you know, a very informative and engaging one. And I can see from the questions that we have that, you know, a lot of people actually, they want to know, they want to know a couple of things, you know, they're very interested in this topic for today. So we have a question from Peter Joel. Peter asks, how do you address issues like efficiency of the building process and best practice when advocating use of local materials? You know, this is addressed to our guests. Khotte, could you please answer this one, please?
I think that's a good question, and Pedro or Untitled Chapter can answer that one.
I can answer, but I saw Pax had risen his hand if he wants to address that.
Well, I think we can all address it, but I just have a short reply to this. I feel like most vernacular architecture is a very organic process. I think the biggest challenge is trying to apply it in an industrial context, where everything can be timed and everything can be pushed according to certain rates and measured and calculated. Most of these buildings were built by the owners themselves. I find most vernacular buildings are built by the owners themselves. But in terms of translating it and making it very efficient, I think it's not so easy, but it's really worth it. That's my take.
I've got a slightly different take on that. I think I agree with what you're saying. The world has become very fast-paced, and certain things can't be done very fast. But at the same time, there's a Portuguese architect who won a Pritzker Prize a few years ago, Eduardo Sotomora, which is very well known. And he's always been an architect that's tried to promote local technologies and local ways of doing things. So for many of his houses, he's used traditional dry wall construction. So it's basically a stone wall that uses no mortar, and every single little stone is locked in. And this is very time consuming. And if you try and design this, you can design it, but you find very few people that can build it. So for him, it was always very important to plan something like this in a project. And before construction started, he would go into the local villages and look for somebody that had that knowledge to do it, and bring those people on board and plan how long it takes to do that into the timeline. And this is how I think you can introduce technologies that are not immediately efficient in an efficient way. It's about the project management and the time that you take to prepare to do something. And this is how we can get that best practice in, and how we can get these things to then be accepted by the wider population. Because if you just do it as an architectural whim, and then you try to compress it and push it into a normal building time frame, it's going to be disappointing, and then it's going to fail and people won't want to use it again.
Yeah, if I can throw something in there, I think we probably do need to identify the people who would be able to execute these different techniques very early on in the process. And I'm actually kind of worried when Pedro said this architect would pick one person, because I've had a project where thatching went horribly wrong because I had identified a single person, and that person happened to get injured. But it also had some, I don't want to call them superstitions, but he had some issues even though he recovered, that made him feel like he wouldn't continue with the project. And I then had to go back and find another person, which was a pretty long process. If we could put together a guild, for instance, of expert thatchers, then you know that whenever you're in a project that involves thatching, you're not just picking from a single individual, but you have this network of people that are experts in that. I think it would help, in every trade where you're going to involve vernacular architecture, to have a pool of people that you can go to.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you. I'm going to hand back to Quinn to continue this conversation. Quinn?
Thank you very much, Terry. Fiona has a question like, hi, I work on legal issues around communities in Lesotho who have been resettled to make way for the Lesotho Highlands Water Project. The houses they used to live in were traditionally built, obviously, with systems for cooking, heating, food storage. New houses provided for communities do not contain any such systems. They are not sustainable. What do people suggest could be ways of accurately comparing the new building with the older style? Pedro, I think you can have that one, especially with the participant design workshop that we hold.
Yeah, I think, thank you for the question, Fiona. And it's a very challenging question, because I remember when the last Highlands Water Project started being planned, and the way it was tendered out, and no criticism to the people running projects, because sometimes they have to make very large decisions that have big financial implications. But unfortunately, participatory design and ensuring that people's views are taken into account in these big infrastructure projects many times is overseen and forgotten. And it wouldn't have taken that long, and it probably wouldn't have cost that much to, before you even start moving one single person, to organize a series of workshops to really understand how people live and how they want to live. Because it wasn't their decision to have a new dam built, and they were asked to move. Therefore, the accommodation they're being moved into should be equivalent, if not better, than the one they were in. And I know this goes into politics, and I don't want to go into politics at all, but the built environment, unfortunately, shapes the way you are. Winston Churchill said that. It's been said many times and misinterpreted many times as well. And therefore, any decision that involves how people are going to live, if it's being imposed, I believe should take into consideration how those people live and how they like to live. And that doesn't take that long, and it's not that complicated. A lot of architects are not trained in doing that, and they find it strange, and they've been educated through the modernist principles of the architect knows better. But it's not always the case, especially when it comes to housing. Maybe when it comes to a public building or to an institution, yes, we have a more technical training. But nobody knows better how they like to live than the people who live in the houses where they live. Sometimes, and I need to caveat that, because sometimes people live in unsanitary conditions, especially what's happened in informal settlements where people moved into cities very fast. And that is something where we also have a role to push back and try and introduce better standards. But the vast majority of rural villages were organized in very disciplined and organic ways that worked, and they worked for centuries. So getting that feedback and that input at an early stage, for me, is really important. And it has to be done before and not after, because now it's much more difficult to change something once it's built than before it was built. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pedro. I have a question. It comes from Matthew. This one for you. He says, in some contexts that I'm aware of, particularly in Ethiopia, I know of circumstances where citizens seek the westernized building methods, concrete block wood and steel structures, etc., because of their perceived view because they perceive it as a more modern building type against the traditional vernacular style and methods. So he asks, what do you see the role of the architect in building with indigenous materials against these views of citizens?
Okay, that is Tole. I wasn't sure if you said Khotle when you said directed.
Yes, that is.
Okay. I think in a sense we kind of covered this earlier on when we said the architects do have a responsibility to inform the public. Having designs that, again, are not, we're not putting them together just because there's a project at hand, but sometimes we have to conceive or conceptualize certain things just to get conversations going in the public. And I think one of the marvels of modern technology is that, I don't know how everybody feels about social media, but just putting an image out there these days of something that's been tackled in, maybe a vernacular style, can get you a lot of people reacting to it. And, you can get people talking about what their attitudes are. You can then get into some more detailed discussions with them. And of course, then there's what we're doing today in this webinar, is getting them around the table to talk a bit further about what they see. So I think that okay, are we still together?
Yeah, you just came back.
Lost me a
Lost
little
you for a
bit.
minute. Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think Pedro also mentioned pattern book. So when I was dealing with traditional neighborhood design, that's something that we did in the communities where we were going to develop residences, is to put together a pattern book and get people signed up for the idea that in this community, this is the look and feel and the technology that we're going to go after. And then you can actually start to get, because this could become a niche, then you can get those people who are interested in this type of design to sign up just based on the fact that, you know, this is a place that's been committed for that type of design. But it's going to be a very tricky thing to take on, I have to admit.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Another question, I think, by Daniela Sharp, and someone is out, the name is called Galaxy 8. I think have the same similar questions of who they can be in contact with if people are trying to plan and design such type of building. I think Pedro, you can also take this one. I think those are similar questions. It's just about who they can contact if they're interested in such information.
I think it's about looking around and seeing people and architects who have this interest. Normally, the starting point would be an architect. If you're in a village, you probably don't have any access to an architect. There might not be any architects locally. So it's looking also towards those village senior, elders that know the technology. And in the case of Lesotho in particular, it's very interesting to think that the whole process of building a house and a homestead had many different stages. And if I hope I don't get this wrong, because it's been a long time since I read up on this, but the homes were originally given to the women, and they were built by the women and decorated in the end by the women. The men would help with any of the heavy work, but unlike in other societies, the homes were not a belonging of the male, of the man. So that changes our view on things as well. And the construction industry is very dominated by men. There's no particular reason for that. It's just cultural. I think it's happened over the years, but it doesn't have to be. And there's a lot of space for diversity and for looking for people that know how to do things. I think finding the artisans and looking the artisans is a key thing, and having this guild or starting to build these guilds, I think is a great idea, because a lot of people don't know where to go if they want to do something like this. I think I don't have much more I can add on that.
Thank you very much, Pedro. Same question. Thank you very much, Pedro, on what you said. I think same question also can be addressed to Parks, but how I'm going to be addressing it to Parks also is, Parks has a building that he is doing and he's building it himself. So I think such questions of where people can go to, Parks can be a testimony of how he went about doing his building or building his building and all the challenges that he came across in doing that.
Oh, yeah, thank you, Quinn. Yeah, I think first, not so much there's not so many people you can, for saying in a village, say an architect, but you will find old people who know how to do things. And I think that the information is very important. It goes back to what I was saying earlier about how we treat this old people's information, how they used to do things before. Going back to the previous question about how we look at our old materials as not modern and all that. I mean, there's so much information I found just randomly. Also because in terms of a process of building, I mean, I'm building a very small house. It's not a very big one, but I've even had even young people. It's a very organic process where you even have kids suggesting things that I wasn't even aware of. And I've kept myself open throughout the process, to to take some of this information. But there's a lot around the world. I think on the internet, you can find people who are interested in these buildings. There's a lot of forums where you can, put questions if you don't, if you don't know the next step or how to do anything. There's a big community of people who are interested in this kind of architecture, and mostly I find them very willing to share what they know. But there's also short courses, about how to say plaster with clay and stuff like this. So it is not well established, in a very structured manner, but the information is there and it's enough. But I feel also what has been very helpful was having professional architects coming to the site and talking to me about it. I mean, I was very interested. In fact, I was really shy at first to have professionals come through, but their input was so good. It gave me so much confidence to carry on with the project. So I think, yeah, it's a bit scattered there, but it's available. I mean, you just have to look for this information. And yeah, I think there is information. You just have to find it somehow. Thank you, Quinn.
Thank you very much, Pax. On the very same topic that we just having now, I don't know if Pedro and Dr. Khotle, you guys have any remarks on the indigenous, on the use of indigenous materials? Words of advice, words of encouragement, Pedro?
I think words of advice is, as we started talking, I mentioned appropriate technology. So if a material is indigenous and has been used in history, there's a very high likelihood it's appropriate for the type of environment where you are. A building that's been there for 100 years and hasn't disappeared probably uses technology that lasts all that time. And we can't say the same for a lot of our concrete blocks and metal sheets for roofs. They rust quite fast and they're not very warm. So if the technology has been for a long time, it might be appropriate. It can probably be developed and made better. That's why I like to talk about a new vernacular. But experiment with it. If you're a designer, if you're considering something, look at it. Don't just disregard it because it's old. I think the fact it's old is actually an advantage. It means it's been tried and tested for a very long time. So see about what you can do with something that's old and make it new. It's all about trying to reinterpret and reusing these technologies for me.
Thank you, Pedro. Dr. Khotle.
Yeah, I think for me, I have the opportunity of dealing with a lot of young and eager designers at the university. I have seen that whenever we put these ideas out there about, how can we reinterpret, what would be something Basotho would identify with, our students have tons of ideas. In fact, with the question you had just asked a little bit earlier, if you ask me about personnel, I think a lot of young architects in Lesotho are eager to be given these commissions, but perhaps they're not easy to find if you don't know where to look. I'd invite anyone who's interested in that to, come down to Limco Queen University. I'm sure even the guys at Ramohlaboli Polytechnic, I have colleagues there that I trust can point you in the right direction. But we have to do something. A lot of us are eager to tackle this issue. We really just don't get enough interest from the public. Like Moabi Pax said earlier in this webinar, there's the majority of our clients are a little bit put off, I think, with connotations about, I'm trying to move ahead in life and you're trying to to introduce a design or use of a certain material that I'm actually trying to put behind me in terms of my evolution or my me improving my life. But if we can package these things well for them, I think they'll be able to look at them in a new light, and that's something we're very capable of.
Thank you, Dr. Khotte. Pax?
This vernacular architecture is timeless. It has been tested, by time, and it's still standing. And every time I see those old buildings, going down, I mean, it goes back to what Pedro was saying. I mean, the fact that they are old, the fact that they're still standing, the fact that they still one, rock above the other, that means there's something worth looking into there. And well, I think sometimes people are not desperate enough. I mean, why would one opt for building a house? I wouldn't even call it a shack out of, metal sheets, while there is earth to build, a wall with. I'm talking about really desperate situations here, in a rural setup. It doesn't make sense to me. So that's why I think, like Dr. Khotle was saying, I attributed this to the psychological issue. There's a sense of prestige that we imagine, this modern, cement bricks, bring us. But like Pedro was saying, I think if most of us were even aware of this, that, in Europe, most of the most beautiful buildings are these oldest ones, the old centers of the towns, of the cities. Those are the most valuable, and there's so much effort and resources, channeled towards preserving them. It's just buildings out of mud, and I think the possibilities are endless, and we could employ them in all different contexts, and let's just try it and experiment. I look at it as art for me, and it's materials that are so gentle to one and very safe to use and to experiment with. So there's nothing to lose, actually, but a lot more to gain.
Okay, thank you very much, Pax. I think also like to continue on answering those questions on who in Lesotho can residents connect to, or who after the call people can look up to. I think one that Khotte just said also with the students from Quinn University of Creative Technology, students from the Ramohlaboli Polytechnic. I think there's vast people that are into the build or construction environment, and those people can be contacted. And also with the rise in we have a program that's called the local fellowship, whereby we have this training of trying to explore different ways of building, or ways that are still there but people are not really trying to use. So people can try and follow us on all the pages that we have, and also like follow those programs. Then you can find those people that have been trained in those ways of finding those outside the box thinking methods. There's also some interesting a note that was written on Facebook from one of the listeners and one of the watchers. A good point. The use of vernacular materials in contemporary design not only gives a sense of self-reflection, improvement of our own traditional technology, and many other stipulated ideas, but all boils down also to contribution positively to the socio-economy conditions of particular place. So I think that's also something that's very powerful. Thank you. I would love to hand over back to Teddy and Daniela. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, Quinn. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you so much. Please do join us on our next webinar on the 29th of April. And we have a survey that we'd like you to fill in the comment box if you're on Zoom, and it's also on the Facebook comment section. So let us know if there are any topics that you'd like us to talk about soon and how we can improve the webinar. So from myself, from Quinn, the RISE team, our wonderful guest, Pedro, Pax, Khotle, thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
See you soon.
Thank you. See you next time.